Welcome to the Health System CIO show. Today's episode is part of our Partner Perspective interview series and features Dr. Simon Koss, Chief Medical Officer with Heidi Health. I'm Anthony Guerra, founder and editor-in-chief. Dr. Koss, thanks for joining me today.
Anthony, great to be here. Thank you.
Oh, you got it. All right, let's start off. Let's hear a little bit about your organization and your role.
So I'm the Chief Medical Officer at Heidi Health. Heidi is a native AI digital health company founded in Melbourne, Australia in 2019 that pivoted early into the AI scribe phenomenon in 2023. And now we're the world's most used scribe. And we've pivoted from that beachhead to run clinicians with cognitive load and administrative burden.
All right, very good. So we're going to talk about a lot of fun issues today. One of them is clinical decision support, sort of AI-powered clinical decision support. I think a great place to frame this up and to start is what's different. What's changing? Why is the AI scribe changing the nature and the review that people should have of clinical decision support? So if you want to lay it out for me, pre-AI scribe, there were tools, some of which got into trouble, right, for influences in clinical decision support. So take us through that sort of pre-AI. There were some issues. And now I think sort of the thesis here is that post-AI, these things need even more scrutiny.
Yeah.
Is that correct framing? And you take me through it.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'd take you even pre-digital. I'm old enough to remember when your decision support was a book that you go reference. And part of the challenge there was you're practicing memory-based medicine, and the ideal is to provide evidence-based care. To do that, you had to read a lot because you had to have that information at your fingertips. You didn't have time in the consultation or with patients to do a literature review. The problem is now that we're exploding with medical evidence. The rate of doubling is every 73 days, which means you need to read about 28 hours a day if you want to stay current. And that's just impossible for anyone. So you're right. I saw decision support introduced digitally in, and there were two problems with the early last generation digital clinical decision support tools. I guess the first is they were provided for the system level benefit rather than the clinician. And that was really hard because you were getting generic alerts firing and they weren't relevant to what was going on in front of you. And that created alert fatigue. So the early phases of active decision support stopped being used unless they were incredibly targeted and useful. So that's active decision support. Passive decision support got better. Instead of pulling out Gray's Anatomy and looking through textbooks, you had these modern digital tools, but they're passive. You had to go to them. They weren't proactive. And that just meant that they were underutilized. So that was pre-AI. When you needed the information, it was still very hard to source the answers. Artificial intelligence came along, and specifically generative AI with large language models. And you could ask yourself a very specific question of the tool and get a tailored response fast. That's an absolute game changer. That's exactly what clinicians want. They want a PhD researcher to go trawl the latest medical literature and come back with an accurate answer that they can trust. And so what that means is evidence-based care now, with the pressures of the time constraints, is actually practical. But the caveat is you've got to be able to trust the tools that you're using.
Right. So we had influence. We had things going on in the past where they were questionable, which way physicians were being directed, that it wasn't just pure the data driving it, but it was the whoever's paying for it. So this was a problem. And this came up. So it was a problem again before AI, but it's a different problem now. Can you take me into that a little bit?
Yeah, and so I think the specific example that's well known and you're probably alluding to is practice fusion parallel, and that was an EHR in the 2000s that started out, and they made it free to the end user, the clinicians. But what they were doing was monetizing de-identified data on the background, and then they were using advertising within the workflow. And the scandal there was that because of kickbacks from Purdue Pharmaceuticals, some of the targeted advertising was contributing to the prescription of opioids and the opioid crisis and all of the rest of that. And that's a very cautionary tale. You've got to know if the product is free, then you are the product. And you've got to evaluate the commercial model behind the organization. So let's say there's a free product and it's evidence, and you're asking questions and you're getting answers that sound really plausible, really good. Are you being shown advertisements as a clinician? And despite clinicians saying, oh, well, that doesn't work on me and I know best and I can filter that out, the reason adverts are there is because they actually do work. So that's the first thing. Advertising does influence your practice. The second thing is if there are no advertisements to you as the end user, but there are commercial kickbacks from pharmaceutical organizations, then the information that you're getting presented with may be ranked according to a model that's not aligned with the best clinical evidence for the question that you're asking. And so being able to understand where the information is coming from and be assured that it's the highest quality and it's untainted by those ranking systems from pharmaceutical organizations and the like, that's really important to be able to trust what you're seeing.
Who do you think is that the chief medical officer in a health system? I mean, there's different people that are going to into play in the conversation we're having today.
Yep.
There's the CIOs, which is sort of one of our core readership, the CIOs, the IT folks. Then there's the hybrids, the CMIOs, who are bridging that world. And then not in our wheelhouse, but probably very instrumental to some of the discussion we're going to have here is the chief medical officer. So the chief, as these, and all these folks have to work together, have been working together, especially from something like this, because you have a digital tool which could easily fall under IT and does fall under IT in many respects. So they're going to be involved in selecting these tools, whether part of their broad EHR package or a different one niche vendor that they're picking. They're going to be involved in that discussion. The CMIO is going to be involved in both elements of that discussion in understanding the IT implications and understanding the medical issues, the clinical issues. And the chief medical officer is probably purely going to have that clinical view in mind. So when it comes to like influence, I suppose that's more in the chief medical officer realm to make sure that the tools we're using that are going to help our clinicians make decisions are not unduly influenced in any way. Tell me if I'm thinking about this correctly. I'm interested in your thoughts on who the players are as you have these solutions that have so many elements to them. Who are the key players that need to be having these discussions?
I think the way you framed it is really nice because there's been a shift. So once upon a time, the digital was the realm of the chief information officer, and that's especially relevant when the tools that you're asking people to use cascade top down and are influenced by the organizational strategy. You need a coherent enterprise architecture that your end users, clinicians, and others are going to use. And that's good. From a risk and compliance perspective, you've gated those, you've whitelisted them. Maybe you've done some penetration testing and security validation, and you know they're the right tools. The chief medical officer, by contrast, historically is responsible for the quality and safety of the workforce. And that includes digital tools, but also their work practices and processes and all of the rest of that. Because those two roles don't share the same objectives. You need a translator in the middle. So it was only in the 2000s that we started to see the chief medical information officer role being formalised, and now you wouldn't run a health system without a CMIO because digital is part of the fabric, and you need someone who's able to have a foot in both camps. But what's happened with this generative AI boom is you've got democratized tools that are actually coming in through the rank and file in the front door. That's shadow AI. And when you're looking at top level governance, you don't necessarily have visibility to all the tools that are being used by everyone in the organization. So instead of being a top-down discussion, it actually now needs to be an organizational discussion about transparency, what's in use, and a recognition that strategy can't always be executed top-down. There needs to be an element of understanding from the bottoms up. What's being used? If it's off-brand for the organizational strategy, why is it being used? And that represents not just a risk, but also an opportunity.
Right. So there's a couple issues there. There's sort of the issue we were originally discussing, which is from the clinical decision support point of view, what are the influences of the information being provided? Uh, you mentioned there's different levels, right? If you see advertisements, at least you see them. You know, it's an advertisement. What it could be a little more concerning, even, is the scenario you described where there's no advertisements, but there is a ranking being influenced by funding. So again, your clinicians are being driven in a certain direction. Um, you have to know about these things. Your organization has decided, this is interesting, right? Your organization has decided we're not going to take any money for no influences. We're not going to charge either. Is that correct for this particular part of our offering? Tell me how that works.
Yeah, sure. It's worth unpacking. So at Heidi, we're clinician led, and one of our co-founders, Dr. Tom Kelly, was a vascular surgical trainee. And as an end user, he wanted these tools. So he's designed the tools that he wished that he had while he was clinically practicing. And it started with Scribe, taking care of the documentation burden and cognitive load. But another element of cognitive load is how do you actually get your hands on the right evidence at the right time? So he's coming from a very principled position, and perhaps this is the Australian perspective, where you're actually not allowed to do pharmaceutical advertising in the clinical workflow. And the whole concept that you would have advertising or pharmaceutical ranking really goes against the health system that we have here in Australia, in the UK, other parts of the world. But I understand that that's commonplace in the US and other areas as well. So when we, as a global company, think about how we're going to set the bar, we've got to set it at the highest level around the world. But it's also being driven by some of those personal principles. And so from a commercial perspective, we don't just make evidence products, we make Scribe products. Those Scribe products generate a paid user base that we can use to cross-subsidize our evidence product. And our evidence product has both free and paid tiers. What we want to do with our mission as a company is double the world's healthcare capacity by 2030. And that means we provide great quality stuff to those who can pay, but we also make an excellent free tier for those who can't pay around the world. And that includes both the Scribe and the evidence products.
Right. So, you had mentioned if it's free, you're the product, but
Yes,
that's not the case here, right? Because there's revenue coming in other areas. So we're just not charging in this area. There's no influence, but don't worry about that. If it's free, I'm the product. You're saying that's not the case here.
correct. So there are differences between the free and the paid evidence tiers at Heidi. But the free tier is those high quality sources that don't sit behind paywalls. There, it is free, it is unlimited. All of the sources are transparent and citation backed, and there are no ads up front or opaque ranking systems in the background. The differences with the paid version are organizational source control. So what we've realized is that when you're a clinician operating in a particular health system, that health system might have guidelines, pathways, protocols that are specific to that organization. What you can do in the paid version of the evidence product is you can add all of that local content to the library that the evidence tool returns answers to, and then it will weight the local guidelines first, if they're available, as well as the evidence that's out there in the clinical web from medical journals and from approved pathway providers.
All right, very good. So I think we've covered the issue of influence around clinical decision support, and that's something folks need to think about. Make sure you, at least you know what's going on with what you're using. Now, the other element of what you're using is we don't know a lot of times what our users are using because, as you said, they're doing their own thing, right? So this is concerning, especially if they're doing their own thing with something where they have some of these influences that we're talking about. So you don't know what they're using, and whatever they're using is driving them in a particular direction. This is not what you want as an organization. Um, as a clinician, it's often said that nobody's trying to do anything nefarious on the clinical side. They're trying to take care of their patients. You mentioned before, hey, if they're using something off-brand, so to speak, or not sanctioned, why? Why are they using it? Because they think they need to use it to take care of their patients. What are you not giving them?
Hmm.
Right? If they're using something like this, what are you not giving them? So, a couple of questions here. The first is, how do you figure out what they're using? And I don't know, that may be something you can answer or maybe not, but as an organization, you'd want to say, okay, first we need to find out what people are using. Maybe we do a survey and let it be anonymous, so people just tell us, you're not going to get in trouble, kind of an amnesty. Just tell us what you're using so we can figure it out. Why are you using it? Okay, and then we have a plan where we're going to we say, okay, they're using these things. They should be able to use things like this. We need to sanction one or multiple options, and then propagate that out and say, okay, you guys were using this stuff. Here's the sanctioned stuff in the safe sandbox. Sign up for it. And now at some point, there's going to be punitive measures for those who keep going off brand, so to speak. Does that make any sense for how you want to move through this, maybe?
Yeah, it does. So I've seen generations of shadow use go on, all the way when your nephew was at IT school and was designing databases and might be able to create you a clinical registry, through to the early democratized tools like Access. We've always had offline Excel spreadsheets that contain patient data. And then as we've moved into the era of the cloud and distributed applications, you can create these tools and increasingly find tools that are democratized and available. So I guess the potential for shadow IT and now shadow AI has increased over time. Our society's become more digitally literate and digitally savvy, and we're probably at an all-time high for these tools being out there and being used. I guess you find the use of shadow IT and shadow AI when there's a mismatch between the job that needs to be done and the tools that are provided. And in this generative AI boom, what we're finding is there's incredibly powerful tools out there that have totally outstripped the capabilities of the systems provided by core IT to the users in the health systems. And I mentioned scribes earlier. If you've got a documentation tool within your EHR and you've got a tool that's actually going to do the documentation for you, that's incredibly attractive, and people are going to lean into it. Now, they know what the organization has asked them to do, and they've made a decision that, hey, there's a better way to do it, and I can justify doing that because I've got so much patient demand. I've only got so much time, and this is a way of efficiently getting my services to as many people as possible. Clinicians are all coming from the right place. No one says, I'm going to turn up to work and cause patient harm or put data at risk. But there's a justification process that's going on in their mind that results in them using these tools. And I said the organization that people are increasingly digitally savvy. They know where value lies. What they're not necessarily doing is the kind of due diligence that enterprise IT would do. They're not asking, where is the data stored? How's it being processed? How's it being secured? Is it being used for training or secondary monetization purposes? These are really important questions. To your specific question, though, how do you know what's
Yeah.
in use at your organization? That requires trust. And so the reason that people are using these tools and not speaking up about it is because they know that the tools, they'll get told not to. As long as they're not told not to, they're going ahead and they're using it. So how do you create a culture of trust? And that's one way that you might be able to do it, anonymous surveys. I think you got to walk the floor a little bit. You can't expect the data to all come to you. So within the various clinical specialties, there are going to be people, and they might not necessarily be the director of that specialty, but there are going to be people who are kind of sociometric power users, connected, know what's going on, and are able to share that information. As long as the right trust environment exists, that gives you a sense of what's being used. And my sense is that we're at an all-time high of these tools being used because there's been an incredible seismic shift in the capabilities of technologies. We need to be doing more of this. We need to be asking what people are using and why, because it's a risk if we ignore it, but it's an opportunity if we lean into it.
Yeah, this is really fascinating. There's a couple issues I'm thinking about here is so you've everybody in the we're talking about the US, right? So everybody in the US is pretty much on a large EHR vendor. A lot of them on Epic, a few on Meditech, a few on Oracle, but a lot of them on Epic. So, as we talk about the draw, the pull for clinicians to use shadow IT or to download something because they're trying to take care of patients, we talk about that pull. That pulls in proportion to the gap they see with what they're being offered. If there's a big gap, as you mentioned, between what the tool I'm being offered and the tool I know exists, my colleagues are using, at another health system, there's the temptation factor. I want to take care of patients. I know there's this better solution, but there's a gap. Sometimes that gap can exist because there's a large pull that I'm sure you're very aware of. There's been a paper out on this recently. I did an interview with the author of the paper. There's a large pull to stay in suite with your EHR tools and to give up some functionality to stay in suite, to not go with the niche vendor that gives you 100% of what people want and to stay in suite and get 75%, 80%, whatever number you want to put on it. The gap there between what you're giving them in terms of functionality and what's possible is the pull to use what's outside of approval. The larger the gap, the more the pull, the more you're going to have people going off brand, so to speak, if they can get it. So that's kind of interesting. And the other issues there is one is just knowledge of what's available, which is also a big issue. I've spoken to a number of people who talk about very large health system. There's a gap between a desire to use a particular tool on a user side and the knowledge of what's available. That's an issue. That's a problem they have. They have it. It's in the health system. They own it. But getting that knowledge disseminated is difficult, and it's almost often a one-off, meaning an inquiry about a tool. Hey, I want this tool. And the path that inquiry has to travel and the time it gets to vet that before that information gets back to the user, oh, we have this. I suspect that could be days, weeks, months. Who knows? And you could have these going a dozen, 2 dozen requests. So something's got to be done there with a knowledge of inventory being disseminated, right? So we got to fix that problem. But again, there's also this problem of a desire to stay in suite and sacrifice some functionality, which creates that pull to go off brand. Your thoughts there?
So we started with digitization, department by department, and we ended up with a bit of a fragmented mess. And that was a challenge for enterprise IT to stitch all these different vendors together and contracts going at renewal at different rates. And the interfacing maintenance of that was a nightmare, not to mention some of the clinical risk that emerged if you broke the medications loop process, for example. And the one size fits all EHR vendor approach of standardization is a very attractive alternative to that. And so then we saw a wave of standardizations happen in the 2000s, and there are always sacrifices for the people who needed niche capability, the renal physicians who needed all of their granular level tracking, the cardiologists who wanted to do the reporting on their, they're not provided typically within the large suite, although they've gotten better over time. So there's always been a tension between use the tools that are provided, but a recognition that the tools that are provided within the EHR suite might not be best of breed when you look across the system. What that means is enterprises need to be strategic about trying to get users to use what they can within the suite, but then a recognition that there are some compelling reasons why you would, and we're going to maintain a stable or a bench that are whitelisted and approved by the organisation, and we'll do our due diligence and give you the assurance that they can be used confidently and safely. I think the challenge in that is now where we're in this explosive era of all of these new tools, all of these new capabilities. They're democratized, so they're walking straight in through the front door. People are unapologetic about using them because my job is to deliver the best patient care. I'm coming at it from two perspectives. One, I need to be as productive as possible. So I'm going to use productivity tools because my documentation experience in the EHR slows me down and I need to free up time to get through my patient load. Or the second is quality. I need to make sure that I'm providing great quality care and minimizing risk. So unless I've got these tools accessible to me, I'm going to go out and self-source and I'm going to start using some of these own tools. There's an opportunity for the enterprise here because that shadow AI use, I consider it an MVP. If you think about standing up an initiative in your organization, let's say you pick productivity or quality, and you've got a hypothesis that we can provide a tool to the users and it's going to make a difference. There's a high risk that you've incubated that idea in a lab and you get out there and you show it to the users and all of a sudden there's poor adoption, and that becomes a change management overhead because we've got to think about communications and diffusion and adoption, and we've got to create champions and metrics and feedbacks and incentives. All of a sudden, that idea of introducing new technology initiatives becomes a push rather than a pull. But if you lean into the phenomenon of shadow AI and you say, these people are using it, there's gravity there, there's a center of mass, why are they using it? What you realize is they've done their MVP for you. They might not be using the tool you would have chosen, but they've identified where the value is, and they see enough value that they're prepared to put some of their political capital on the line to go use it, even though the organisation hasn't sanctioned it. So now they've de-risked any of the projects that you might want to undertake. So let's say people are out there using an evidence tool, and within my EHR suite, evidence is not a product that's provided natively or at a quality bar. Let's actually now put a bit of a procurement in place, or at least a project to evaluate what are the tools, which ones should we be using And now you might not be returning the same tool to them, but you're solving the problem that led to AI in the first place. And I think from your inventory perspective, that comes back to how do we get people using the tool? You start with the tools that people are already using and the need that's there. And then you'll find that there's a pull rather than a push.
What would your advice be to CIOs that feel that pull to stay in suite? Because as all the reasons you mentioned, um, it sounds like that's understandable, but, and I've had many discussions on this topic. You cannot be completely beholden to staying in suite. You can't just say that's the end of the line. We're going to get what they have, and when they have it, we'll get it. And if they don't have it, we're not getting it. And most people say, yeah, we'll do the one-off, but we try and keep it to a minimum. But there is that sort of, you're always sacrificing, or you could be sacrificing some functionality there. What would your advice be to the CIOs out there about making those decisions?
Yeah, it comes back to what your workforce needs and what the purpose of your organization is. So, the purpose of your organization is to deliver healthcare services, and the workforce need the right tools to do that. And there will be a tension between staying in suite and using the tools that you've already got licenses availability for. But the use of shadow AI is going to tell you when there's a mismatch. And that's the opportunity to say, radio, for this particular use case or function, it might not exist in suite today. Maybe there's a roadmap to get to it. But the practical reality is, unless we actually lean into it, this shadow AI use is going to continue. It's going to be risk and exposure for our organization. You think about the data that we hold, which is highly sensitive and confidential, and we're using them, it's being exposed through these unvetted sources. Maybe we need to lean into this phenomenon. Maybe we time box it and we do single year contracts until our suite vendor has caught up. And then eventually, if the capability that's provided by your suite vendor is comparable and acceptable, you can switch over at a point in time. But I think the days of the suite vendors being able to do everything that's required in this fast moving environment are gone. When I think about what we've got here at Heidi, we've got 120 of some of the best AI engineers in the world, and they've got a singular focus on a very narrow set of products, scribe and evidence. They're working hard on that. And then I think about the thousands of people that might be working at suite vendors, but you ask what their competence in a specific domain is, and you realize that the orders of scale are different. The specialist will always introduce innovation and quality at a superior bar to the suite vendors. And then I think the suite vendors will catch up. And we're seeing that happen with Scribe at the moment.
Yeah, very good. Uh, so I understand, and I've done a little, some research. Can we use the term these days, you are a Claude shop? Is that how we would discuss it? Your tools, or at least your evidence tool, is underpinned by Claude. So I've heard different CIOs talk about having to make a decision as a health system. Who are we going with? There has to, which is really fascinating, right? Because we make decisions all the time. So the biggest decision they made was on their EHR suite. That's a big decision they made, spend lots of money. They're sort of enterprise resource planning is there's another big package there. Um, and it seems like an organization like yours, does that make sense? You have to pick what model you are going to use as your underpinning, and it could have been GPT, but you happen to pick Claude. Is that the right way to think of it?
No, we haven't done that.
Okay.
We'll be model agnostic and we'll lean into whichever models are performant. In the early days of Scribe, and I know the question's on evidence, but in the early days of Scribe, OpenAI had the frontier models that were leading, and we lent into them. When Gemini and Anthropic models became performant and sometimes superior, we're able to swap. So we developed a concept of model agnosticity. And then we realized that we had enough volume that we were able to actually create our own internal open weighted models.
Okay.
And so behind the scenes at Heidi, we use a mix of models, both off commercial off the shelf and our own in-house developed models, and we'll always use the most performant ones for the task.
Okay. All right. Very good. Just one other sort of line of questioning. And I've seen that you, and I don't know if this applies to all your products or just one, are trying to work to get registered as a medical device. And I know that that's an issue with a lot of tools out there, and most of them are not trying to do that because it's very onerous. It's not easy to get registered with the FDA as a medical device. But many of these tools walk up to that line and dance around that line in that gray area. It makes a lot of IT executives at health systems very uncomfortable because all of a sudden, if the FDA and comes out and says, by the way, to the vendor, you're a medical device. You're operating as a medical device. You need to go get registered. I don't know how that plays out downstream for customers who are using that tool. If there's a delay, meaning you have to stop using it at some point, if there's a time, but it creates uncertainty and concern. So it's just a fascinating new area. I'll call it the medical device gray eye area that people are playing in and dancing in. And you're saying, hey, we're going to go get registered as a medical device. Either we are a medical device or we don't want to play in the gray area. We're just going to get clear, which makes a lot of sense, but it's a lot of work or everyone would be doing it. So, what are your thoughts around that?
Yeah, this is a fast moving target. And so we're going to find that regulation always lags capability. In this instance, the FDA is very clear on exemption criteria for clinical decision support. And so we've approached the development of Heidi evidence with that in mind. So we know where the line is and we can step up to it without stepping over it. And what that means is generally you're using Heidi evidence as a passive decision support tool where you're specifically asking it questions and it's behaving like a smart search, which is a superior alternative to going out and asking Google or an untrained a medically untrained model, you're getting a higher quality answer there. So that's the current state with the FDA in the US. But when you take it from a global perspective, Heidi's a global company. We operate in all jurisdictions. Some are extremely stringent. So when I think about regulatory high bar, the UK's MHRA is about as high as it gets. And we operate across all jurisdictions. So we need to go there anyway. So we've got a high appetite to lean into getting all relevant Heidi products registered as medical devices. Scribe's a class 1 medical device in the UK. The evidence will be at least a 2A, maybe a 2B. And the ability to deploy in regions like the US allows us to get some of our evidence claims usage, take it through there, and then have an evidence product that's certified by the world's highest benchmark. And what that will mean is we'll have a product in the US where there is no such benchmark, and there'll be a differential appetite between different providers to go chase registration. You're right, there's a considerable compliance overhead to get there in the first place, and then you carry liability in doing so. It'll sort out those people who really want to provide that and play in that space. And we've certainly got that appetite to provide the highest quality evidence we can and move into the next phase because we think that's where a lot of the clinical value will come from.
Any thoughts for our hospital IT folks out there with this kind of an issue when there are tools that and you'll always have the particular vendors saying, we don't do that, we don't do that, we don't do that, because they know they're dancing around the line. So they want to be very clear that when they're not close to the line, or they think they're not close to the line. But again, I have heard concern on the provider side of, hey, there is some discomfort here or some concern. What would your advice be to IT executives at health systems about making sure that they handle all of this properly.
Yeah, regulation does create that clarity, but it's a feature of a mature market. And right now, this space is new. It's immature. That means that there are a lot of providers coming with differential levels of ambition. Already, though, you're starting to see the organizations that are attracting scale usage. And so there's bigger and smaller providers. And then I think the question of their appetite to go into regulated territory is a good one you can ask of your evidence provider. Do you plan to move into the regulated medical device territory? Why? Why not? And that can factor into your thinking. It's important when you think about it because these tools are going to be used by clinicians. And until regulation comes along, you carry that liability internally. So a positive signal is an organization that intends to become a regulated medical device because they're going to take that liability from you as the regulatory posture evolves.
All right, we're almost out of time, Dr. Cost. I do want to say it's kind of interesting that, we in the US, we think that we're the best at everything and number one all the time, but there's higher bars out there. You mentioned the UK for some of this regulatory stuff has an extremely high bar. Australia, you said no influence in any clinical decision support. So sometimes I guess you come here and you're like, oh, we're good because we already play other places. So it's interesting.
Look, there's pros and cons to regulation. The US, because of the current regulatory posture, is leaning right into the AI economy, the burgeoning AI
Hmm.
boom, and
Yeah.
that's great for innovation. It also means that it brings along with it inherent risk.
Hmm.
For places like the UK, who adopt a cautious conservative regulatory posture, they're going to reap some of the benefits of these technologies later, but they're going to do it in a de-risked fashion. So I wouldn't put it as one is better than the other. But as we look at it globally, we can actually learn from each jurisdiction. I think they inform each other.
All right, very good. Any final thoughts, Dr. Costa? This has been a really fun chat. Any final piece of advice? Again, we're dealing with anyone from the CIOs to the CMIOs, the CNIOs, the CISOs, who we haven't even talked about, the security people. But you being a clinician, let's talk to the CMIOs. Let's get your best piece of advice for a CMIO at a health system in the United States.
Look, for someone who's been in digital health now for 24 years, I think this period of generative AI technology is some of the most exciting out there, but it's also the most difficult to navigate. We're putting in digital technology now, not just for the benefit of the enterprise and the system, but for the practicing well-being and experience of the clinician. That means that the disenfranchised clinicians who've had a terrible experience with prior IT rollouts now, we're throwing them a bone. That's exciting. That will create champions, that will create opportunities, that will create enthusiasm, and it can ultimately drive better care. I've never had as many conversations about how do you have a career in digital health from practicing clinicians. And now we've got this formalized role in the CMIO. It's a really important position. And to navigate this new era properly, everyone needs to understand what's out there, what's being used, what are the pros, what are the cons. I've really enjoyed today's conversation because we've explored a lot of the key issues. So thank you for the opportunity to come on and talk with you about it today.
You got it, Dr. Cost. It's been my pleasure. I hope you have a safe trip when you go back to Australia and enjoy your journey. And thank you for your time today. I hope we can catch up with you down the road.
Very welcome, Anthony. Thank you.
Have a great day.